The war's next phase may not begin with a new weapon or a dramatic map change, but with a single unsettling question. What happens when a country that has survived through endurance decides that survival alone is no longer enough? That question has begun to define Ukraine's posture as the conflict moves toward 2026. For more than 3 years, Ukraine's strategy was dominated by necessity holding ground, absorbing punishment, and preventing collapse under relentless pressure. That approach worked, but it came at a brutal cost and produced only incremental shifts along the front. Now the narrative is changing. Signals from Kyiv indicate a deliberate turn away from a purely defensive mindset toward one that seeks to regain initiative, impose costs on Russia beyond the front line, and reshape the tempo of the war itself. This shift is not framed as a reckless gamble or a dramatic all-out push. Instead, it is presented as a calculated response to how the war has evolved. Russian forces continue to press forward using mass persistence and attrition, but the results have grown increasingly disproportionate. Advances measured in meters have come at the price of thousands of casualties, eroding the very manpower base that once allowed Moscow to sustain pressure. Ukraine, meanwhile, has demonstrated that it can hold even under extreme strain. The question confronting its leadership is whether continuing to absorb blows indefinitely risks freezing the conflict into a grinding stalemate that favors the side willing to lose more people. The answer emerging from Kyiv appears to be no. Recent statements and operational patterns suggest that Ukraine's leadership now views offense not as a luxury, but as a necessity for long-term survival. Defense can delay defeat, but it rarely produces victory. The logic is blunt. If Russia is allowed to dictate the rhythm of fighting, it can choose where and when to concentrate force, even if that force is inefficient. By shifting to selective offensive actions, Ukraine aims to disrupt that rhythm, forcing Russian commanders to react rather than plan, and stretching already strained reserves across wider areas. This does not mean abandoning defensive depth. Instead, it implies layering defense with sudden localized strikes designed to fracture Russian formations and expose weaknesses. The timing of this transition is crucial. Ukraine is not making this move at a moment of desperation, but at a point when Russian momentum appears increasingly brittle. Throughout 2025, Russian forces captured territory at a pace far slower than political deadlines suggested, often failing to meet publicly stated objectives. Cities targeted for rapid seizure remained contested months later, while supply lines lengthened and morale problems mounted. Ukraine's defenders exploited these delays through small but telling counterattacks that stalled advances and forced Russia to commit additional units just to hold what it had taken. These actions offered a preview of what a more assertive strategy could look like when scaled up. Equally important is the psychological dimension. For Ukraine's population and its partners, the language of permanent defense risks creating fatigue and resignation. A strategy that openly acknowledges the need to strike back sends a different signal that the war has not settled into inevitability. It reinforces the idea that outcomes remain contested and that Russian gains are reversible. For Moscow, the implication is more troubling. The Kremlin has long relied on the assumption that Ukraine would eventually be exhausted by losses and pressure. A Ukraine willing and able to go on the offensive undermines that assumption and forces a reassessment of how long the war can be sustained. This emerging posture also reflects lessons learned the hard way. Earlier attempts to regain large swaths of territory showed the dangers of overreach and predictability. The current messaging emphasizes flexibility, speed, and limited objectives rather than sweeping breakthroughs. Offense in this framing is not about dramatic arrows on a map, but about constant pressure keeping Russian forces off balance, degrading their logistics, and creating conditions where defense alone is no longer sufficient for them either. As this strategic pivot takes shape, the central uncertainty is not whether Ukraine can defend itself. It has already proven that, but whether it can translate resilience into momentum without repeating past mistakes. Can a carefully calibrated offensive strategy change the trajectory of a war defined for so long by endurance, or will it simply deepen the cycle of attrition on new terms? If Ukraine's decision to lean into offense represents a change in intent, the transformation of its armed forces explains how that intent can realistically be carried out. Beneath the headlines about drones, missiles, and frontline clashes lies a quieter but more consequential story, a systematic restructuring of how Ukraine fights. In the early phases of the war, Ukraine relied heavily on improvised command structures, rotating leadership teams, and emergency formations created under fire. Those arrangements allowed the country to survive the initial shock, but they also imposed limits. Decision-making was slower than ideal coordination, across units was uneven, and long-term planning often gave way to short-term crisis management. As the war dragged on, those weaknesses became increasingly apparent. By late 2024 and throughout 2025, Ukrainian military planners began addressing these structural constraints with a focus on permanence and coherence. Temporary groupings were gradually replaced by stable command corps, each responsible for a defined set of brigades and operational sectors. This change may sound bureaucratic, but its battlefield implications are profound. Stable command relationships allow officers to understand their unit's strengths and limitations in detail, shorten the time between intelligence collection and action, and reduce the friction that comes with constantly rotating leadership. In practical terms, this means orders move faster, coordination improves, and opportunities can be exploited before they disappear. This restructuring has also altered how Ukraine integrates different branches of its forces. Earlier in the war, artillery, infantry, air defense, and drone units often operated in parallel rather than as a tightly synchronized system. The new model emphasizes integration at lower levels of command, allowing combined arms effects to be generated more quickly and with fewer resources. Small units can now call on surveillance drones, precision fires, and electronic warfare support without waiting for approval to move up and down a fragmented chain of command. This responsiveness is particularly critical for offensive actions that depend on speed and surprise rather than mass. Training has evolved alongside organization. Instead of focusing primarily on defensive drills and static fortifications, Ukrainian units increasingly train for short, intense engagements designed to seize limited objectives and then consolidate. These drills reflect an understanding that modern battlefields punish prolonged exposure. Precision weapons, loitering munitions, and constant aerial surveillance make lingering in one place dangerous. The emphasis is therefore on striking quickly, achieving a defined goal, and transitioning immediately back into a defensive posture before an effective counterstrike can be mounted. Another key development is the professionalization of logistics and support. Offensive operations do not fail only because of enemy resistance. They fail because ammunition, fuel, medical evacuation, or engineering support cannot keep pace. Ukraine's reforms have sought to reduce these vulnerabilities by decentralizing logistics planning and embedding support elements more closely with combat units. The result is a force better able to sustain repeated actions without long pauses to reorganize. This capability is essential if offense is to be more than a one-off gesture. These changes are already visible in how Ukraine has fought in recent months. Instead of large, highly publicized pushes, there has been a pattern of smaller counterblows that disrupt Russian advances, reclaim limited areas, and force Moscow to divert resources. Each action on its own may appear modest, but collectively they point to a force that is learning how to impose costs while managing risk. The goal is not spectacle, but cumulative pressure. Importantly, this evolution has taken place under constant enemy fire and with finite resources. That fact alone suggests a level of institutional learning that many observers underestimated early in the war. Ukraine is no longer fighting as an emergency militia defending its capital. It is fighting as a state that has adapted its military system to a prolonged high-intensity conflict. This adaptation underpins the credibility of any offensive strategy planned for 2026. Yet transformation brings its own questions. Structural reform and better integration can enable sharper operations, but they also raise expectations. If Ukraine's military is now faster and more flexible, can it maintain that edge as the conflict intensifies and resources remain contested? And will these reforms prove sufficient when tested against an opponent that, despite its losses, still commands significant depth and firepower? The most striking paradox of Russia's campaign is that the very strategy designed to wear Ukraine down has instead begun to hollow out Russia's own warfighting capacity. For much of the conflict, Moscow relied on attrition as a blunt instrument, betting that numerical superiority and tolerance for losses would eventually overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. That logic appeared plausible in the early stages, when Russia could replace casualties quickly and sustain pressure across multiple axes. By 2025, however, the balance shifted. Losses continued to mount, but the returns diminished sharply, turning attrition from a weapon into a trap. On the battlefield, the math has become increasingly unfavorable for Russia. Advances often come at staggering human cost, with entire units degraded to secure marginal gains. These losses are not confined to elite formations. They increasingly include newly mobilized or contract soldiers with limited training, further reducing combat effectiveness. The result is a cycle in which units are fed into the fight faster than they can be properly prepared, leading to higher casualty rates and even faster depletion. Attrition, once manageable through scale, now compounds itself. This dynamic is exacerbated by the nature of modern warfare. Constant surveillance from drones, precision-guided munitions, and long-range strikes make massed assaults extraordinarily expensive. Russian forces that attempt to push forward without overwhelming fire support or effective coordination are quickly identified and targeted. Even when attacks succeed tactically, the aftermath often leaves units too depleted to exploit success. Ukraine has capitalized on this by avoiding decisive engagements when possible, and instead forcing Russia to bleed across a wide front. Manpower has become the clearest indicator of strain. Recruitment drives that once delivered a steady stream of replacements have begun to show signs of fatigue. Financial incentives, while still substantial, appear to be losing their appeal as casualty reports spread and social networks absorb the reality of the front. Each month that losses outpace recruitment narrows Russia's margin for error. The problem is not only numerical, quality suffers as well. A force increasingly composed of hastily trained personnel struggles to execute complex operations or adapt to unexpected resistance. The psychological toll should not be underestimated. Soldiers rotated into units with heavy losses inherit not only depleted ranks, but also the knowledge of what awaits them. Morale erodes when gains are measured in ruins and trenches, rather than meaningful progress. This erosion manifests in discipline issues, lower cohesion, and reduced willingness to take initiative. Commanders respond by tightening control, which further slows decision-making and reduces flexibility. The force becomes reactive, locked into patterns that are predictable and exploitable. Ukraine's emerging offensive posture is designed to exploit precisely these vulnerabilities. By launching localized counterattacks against weakened or overextended Russian units, Ukraine forces Moscow to confront the limits of its attritional approach. Each successful strike amplifies the manpower problem by compelling Russia to reinforce threatened sectors, spreading already thin reserves even thinner. The effect is cumulative losses mount response times, slow and defensive lines grow brittle. This attrition trap also has strategic implications beyond immediate casualties. A military consumed by constant replacement struggles to modernize or innovate. Training cycles are shortened, equipment maintenance is deferred, and institutional learning stalls. Over time, the force becomes less capable of dealing with a dynamic opponent that is actively adapting. Ukraine's reforms discussed earlier stand in sharp contrast to this stagnation, highlighting a divergence in trajectories rather than mere fluctuations in fortune. None of this implies an imminent collapse. Russia retains significant resources depth and the ability to absorb punishment. But the direction of travel matters. Attrition that once promised eventual success now threatens to lock Russia into a position where it cannot decisively advance, yet cannot easily disengage. In such a scenario, Ukraine's shift toward selective offense becomes a force multiplier, turning Russian persistence into a liability. The question that follows is whether this imbalance can be sustained. If Russia's attritional strategy continues to consume manpower faster than it can be replaced, does the Kremlin double down despite the cost? Or does it seek a fundamentally different approach to avoid a slow erosion of its military power? While the fighting along the front lines captures the most attention, the deeper strain on Russia's war effort is increasingly visible far from the trenches. The conflict has expanded into a contest of endurance that reaches into factories, refineries, transport hubs, and state finances. Over time, these rear area pressures have begun to shape what is possible on the battlefield. Ukraine's evolving strategy recognizes that degrading Russia's ability to sustain war may be just as decisive as defeating its units in direct combat. One of the most consequential developments has been the steady expansion of strikes against energy and industrial infrastructure. Facilities that once sat safely beyond the reach of conventional artillery are now exposed to long-range drones and missiles. These attacks are not symbolic. Energy production and refining are central to Russia's economy and to the military supply chain that depends on fuel lubricants and electricity. When refineries go offline or pipelines are disrupted, the effects ripple outward, constraining logistics, increasing costs, and forcing difficult trade-offs between civilian consumption and military needs. The cumulative impact of these strikes has been significant. Temporary shutdowns have reduced output, while repairs stretch resources already strained by sanctions and labor shortages. Each disruption forces the state to divert funds and technical expertise away from other priorities. Over time, this erodes the financial buffer that once allowed Russia to absorb shocks. War becomes more expensive just as revenue becomes less reliable, creating a tightening squeeze that is hard to reverse quickly. These economic pressures intersect directly with manpower issues. Recruitment incentives rely heavily on state funding, whether through bonuses, salaries, or compensation for families. As fiscal space narrows, sustaining these incentives becomes more difficult. Even small delays or reductions can have outsized psychological effects, signaling uncertainty and weakening confidence in the state's promises. The result is a feedback loop. Fewer volunteers lead to heavier reliance on those already in uniform, increasing casualties and further discouraging recruitment. Rear area vulnerabilities also extend to transportation and logistics. Rail lines, depots, and storage facilities are essential for moving troops and equipment across vast distances. Disruptions, even localized ones, slow deployment and complicate planning. Commanders must factor in longer transit times and higher risks of supply shortfalls, reducing operational flexibility. For a military already struggling to coordinate complex offensives, these constraints are particularly damaging. Ukraine's approach to these targets reflects a broader strategic logic. Rather than seeking immediate collapse, the aim appears to be persistent pressure that forces Russia to operate under constant constraint. Each strike may be repaired, but the accumulation of damage stretches capacity and attention. Over months, this pressure reshapes the strategic environment, limiting Russia's options and increasing the cost of every decision. The political implications are equally important. Economic stress rarely remains confined to spreadsheets. Inflation, taxation changes, and service cuts affect public perception and tolerance for prolonged war. While state messaging seeks to frame hardship as patriotic sacrifice, lived experience can undermine that narrative. The gap between official optimism and everyday strain widens, creating a subtle but real erosion of domestic support. For Ukraine, these developments reinforce the case for a combined strategy of defense, selective offense, and deep strikes. Weakening the rear reduces the strength of the front, making localized breakthroughs more feasible and less costly. It also aligns military action with broader strategic goals, linking battlefield success to long-term pressure on the adversary's capacity to wage war. The unanswered question is how resilient this system truly is. Can Russia adapt quickly enough to protect its economic lifelines and stabilize its finances, or will sustained pressure from multiple directions gradually narrow its ability to respond, setting the conditions for more decisive shifts on the battlefield? Every shift in strategy carries the weight of past experience, and for Ukraine, the memory of earlier setbacks looms large. The most prominent of these was the ambitious counteroffensive launched in 2023, an operation that raised expectations but ultimately fell short of its objectives. That campaign revealed hard truths about modern warfare. Against a prepared adversary, mass alone is insufficient. Predictability is dangerous, and ambition must be matched to capacity. Rather than being buried, those lessons have become central to how Ukraine now approaches offensive planning. One of the clearest takeaways from that period was the cost of overextension. By attempting to advance along multiple axes simultaneously, Ukrainian forces diluted their combat power and gave Russia time to adapt. Defensive belts layered with mines and fortified positions absorbed the initial blows and slowed momentum. Once the element of surprise was lost, progress became incremental and casualties mounted. The experience underscored the danger of pursuing sweeping breakthroughs without first creating the conditions for sustained exploitation. The recalibration that followed has been deliberate. Instead of aiming for dramatic territorial gains in a single push, Ukrainian planners now emphasize limited objectives tightly linked to broader operational goals. A village, a ridgeline, or a logistics node becomes valuable not for its symbolic importance, but for how it disrupts enemy cohesion. This approach reflects an understanding that modern battlefields reward precision and patience over spectacle. Success is measured by the enemy's degradation rather than by headlines. Timing has also become a central concern. The earlier counteroffensive was preceded by months of public discussion, allowing Russia to anticipate the direction and scale of the attack. In contrast, recent Ukrainian actions have emphasized unpredictability. Decisions are made closer to execution, and operations are launched with minimal signaling. This compresses the adversary's response window and increases the likelihood of achieving surprise even against an opponent with extensive surveillance capabilities. Technological adaptation plays a key role in this new approach. The integration of drones for reconnaissance, targeting, and strike missions has transformed how small units operate. These systems allow Ukrainian forces to identify weak points quickly and apply force, precisely reducing the need for large concentrations of troops. When combined with electronic warfare and precision fires, They create localized superiority that can be exploited briefly before the enemy can react. The objective is not to hold exposed ground indefinitely, but to strike, consolidate, and then shift focus. Another lesson drawn from past failures concerns force protection. Offensive action does not negate the need for strong defense. It heightens it. Ukrainian doctrine now stresses maintaining layered defenses even while conducting attacks, ensuring that gains do not come at the expense of vulnerability elsewhere. This balance aims to prevent the kind of counterblows that stalled earlier advances and to preserve hard-won positions against inevitable retaliation. These adjustments suggest a maturing strategic culture shaped by experience rather than theory. Ukraine is no longer testing ideas in isolation. It is refining them under fire. The result is an offensive concept that is narrower in scope, but deeper in impact, designed to be repeatable rather than decisive in a single stroke. Over time, such operations can accumulate effects that alter the strategic balance without demanding unsustainable sacrifices. Yet even the most carefully crafted doctrine faces uncertainty in execution. Warfare remains contingent, shaped by chance weather morale and enemy adaptation. As Ukraine prepares to apply these lessons on a larger scale, the critical question is whether incremental gains and persistent pressure can coalesce into a strategic turning point, or whether the conflict will continue to resist resolution despite smarter tactics and hard-earned wisdom. As Ukraine's strategy evolves from endurance toward initiative, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. What is unfolding is not only a test of military adaptation, but a signal to the broader international system about how prolonged high-intensity war reshapes power dynamics. For NATO, the United States and allied partners, Ukraine's shift toward selective offense carries implications that reach into deterrence policy, force planning, and perceptions of resolve. The conflict has become a proving ground for modern warfare, and the lessons drawn from it will influence strategic thinking well into the next decade. From a Western perspective, Ukraine's ability to move beyond pure defense reinforces the argument that sustained support can produce tangible strategic effects. The narrative of inevitable stalemate weakens when a smaller state demonstrates the capacity to absorb pressure, learn, and adapt faster than a larger adversary. This challenges assumptions about the limits of assistance and highlights the importance of long-term investment rather than short-term crisis response. For NATO planners, it underscores the value of helping partners build resilient command structures, integrated capabilities, and the institutional capacity to evolve under fire. The implications for deterrence are particularly significant. If Russia's attritional approach continues to falter under combined military and economic pressure, it sends a message about the risks of protracted aggression against a determined and supported opponent. That message resonates beyond Eastern Europe. In other regions where military coercion is used to test boundaries, the Ukrainian case offers a data point: persistence alone does not guarantee success if the adversary can impose rising costs and deny decisive outcomes. Deterrence, in this sense, is reinforced not by dramatic victories, but by the visible failure of aggression to achieve its aims. At the same time, Ukraine's strategy highlights the limits of traditional metrics of power. Large inventories and manpower pools matter less when operational effectiveness, adaptability, and logistics are degraded. For Western militaries, this reinforces ongoing debates about force design in an era of precision warfare and constant surveillance. The emphasis shifts toward integration, speed of decision-making, and resilience against disruption, qualities that Ukraine has been forced to develop under extreme conditions. Politically, the conflict continues to test unity and endurance among Ukraine's supporters. An offensive posture raises expectations and scrutiny. Successes can energize public opinion, while setbacks risk being magnified. Managing this balance requires careful messaging and realistic goals. For allied governments, the challenge lies in sustaining support without overpromising outcomes. Ukraine's incremental approach, focused on cumulative pressure rather than dramatic breakthroughs, may offer a more sustainable narrative for long-term engagement. There is also a broader strategic competition at play. As global attention shifts among multiple theaters from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific, the outcome in Ukraine influences perceptions of Western capacity to manage simultaneous challenges. A Ukraine that can hold, adapt, and push back strengthens the credibility of collective responses elsewhere. Conversely, visible fatigue or fragmentation would carry consequences far beyond the region. Ultimately, Ukraine's evolving strategy represents a convergence of military necessity and geopolitical signaling. It is an attempt to shape not only the battlefield, but the strategic environment in which future decisions will be made. Whether this approach can deliver lasting change remains uncertain, but its implications are already reshaping how power endurance and adaptation are understood in modern conflict. The open question is whether this gradual rebalancing will solidify into a new equilibrium that deters further escalation, or whether it will provoke new tests of resolve from actors watching closely across the world.